Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Okay. Hi, Bernhard. Thanks for joining me on the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Hey, glad to meet you, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually become a pretty big fan of your podcast, which you do with your wife, Laura, The Cosmic Matrix. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you is because in listening to it, it's really fascinating to me that you have this ability to speak in kind of a psycho-spiritual language, in the language of story and myth, and a lot of like esoteric viewpoints or symbology. You're able to talk about all these things, but at the same time, you're able to kind of analyze the world that we live in a way where you're separated from it. And so, for example, like I hear you guys talk about kind of the political spectrum, the left and the right, but I don't hear you speak as if you're embedded in it, as if you're on one side or the other. And it was really refreshing to me. And so as I got into your podcast more, I mean, you guys cover so many different topics in a way where you're able to step back and just analyze it, whether it's masculinity, whether it's, the culture wars, whether it's activism and what's going on in the world, the geopolitics. And so, yeah, just for starters, I think your podcast really drew me into the way that you guys view the world. And so I really appreciate that approach that you guys take.
Oh, thank you, man. Thank you for recognizing that. I mean, that's really our intention as well. It's been part of my path also to always understand, it's on the basis that the holistic approach towards the quote unquote awakening process of inner and outer work, right? We need to question what's going on in the world, I feel, right? We don't want to fall into spiritual bypassing or think that you need to shut out the outside world because you're so spiritually evolved, or, politics are beneath me and all these kind of things. I think everything has its part. And I used to be all of that as well, right? I thought very highly of myself 20 years ago when I thought I figured it all out already. And had to eat humble cake many times, realizing the importance of the inner work, understanding my projections, my shadow, my cultural, social conditioning, childhood wounds, whatever it may be, right? And that's determines your level of consciousness, everything which you perceive the world through, right? So that, hence, we need to cleanse our perception, so to speak, to see things more objectively. And, through the inner work, it helps me, and also with Laura as well, to give talk about the outside world and have a more detached, objective view. I would never claim to be fully objective. That's a highly enlightened state, right? But it's true. I'm not identified with any side, you know what I mean? I'm seeing it more in the context of the evolution of consciousness. That's really what it comes down to. And there has been changes, in my work on my website, Veil of Reality, even before I met Laura, written about it. I was a hardcore type of anarchist, so was never identified with left or right. I always thought it's two wings of the same bird and this and that. But with that came a certain level of, I have to admit, self-importance. Like, I know everything, like politics is for the sheeple, right? It's just two wings of the same bird and all of that. And voting, I even still on my website, articles about voting doesn't do anything. And, just everybody's in cahoots with the same forces controlling this world. But in my own inner process, especially doing the psycho-spiritual work, which psycho-spiritual work means combining psychological and spiritual work, right? So doing the inner child work, the shadow work, and kind of aspiring to a higher nature or the divine God, whatever you want to call it. But in this process, then I realized more and more through inner experience that things are way more nuanced and not that black and white. It's not like, oh, those are the bad guys, these are the good guys, which is so easy to fall into. And it's so easy to identify with. I can see it even with myself, right? I guess I was maybe more leftist liberal on some level when I used to live in California, but never identified. And then I found, over the past few years, I have some conservative values within myself, but I can still, whatever identity is, and people always like to put a label on you. They have a hard time with nuance. Like Laura and I, we have been called all kinds of different things. I've been labeled as new age, leftist, hippie, all the way to right-wing white supremacist. So, or whatever you may, or I've been called shill and controlled opposition, all of this, because I question even certain things in the quote-unquote truther movement. And it's really hard, I realize, for people to deal with ambivalence, meaning they have to have a certain certainty about what to see and what to believe in. And it's really hard for people to stay in the unknown and maybe more like, well, that's interesting what's going on. Let's just see what happens without rushing to conclusions right away. So that's where it comes from. And it's represented in our podcast with Laura. We really want to give the people practical tools, or insight into what's going on in the world. And really practical things they can also apply in everyday life. Because I think with what's happening in the world, you cannot separate yourself anymore from anything. It's not like the grass is greener on the other side. Everybody has this idealistic view of wanting to escape to some island, get away from it all. As it happened, by the way, during COVID. I've seen so many people escape to Costa Rica, Mexico, this and that, right? To get out of here. To each their own, but many of them came back or didn't turn out how it thought it turned out. Because why? Because you're still with yourself and you bring your own stuff with you, and it will affect anything wherever you live, right? So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, like where, why we do what we do. And I have no, for me, there's no set idea of what I will be doing. It's just whatever happens, in my own life, in my own inner process, also with Laura together, that will determine what we will do in the future. Because if you would have told me 15, 20 years ago that I'm doing what I'm doing now, I would have not believed you, right? So there's a high alignment comes with that as well. So I've kind of, I have a more detached view of the world without dissociating, right? That's another issue. You don't want to dissociate and mistake that for like a healthy detachment.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, for me, the shadow work, the child trauma work, it revealed so many things about myself and about the structures that I had grown up in. And then I was probably around COVID, which is probably similar for a lot of people, when I really started to see those structures on a bigger and bigger level, where the same types of mechanisms were operating in the family that I grew up in the religion that I grew up in the country that I grew up in. And I found it just very, I guess, eye-opening. But then if you look around, there are so many people who can get to one level of that. They can recognize, I need to work through this trauma. But in some other aspect of their life, they're still trapped by a story or by some institution, some structure. And even in the world of podcasting, in the world of blogging, the social media sphere, there are a lot of people who are preaching, self-help, they're preaching recovery, they're preaching healing, but they're so dogmatic about other things that it took a while for me digging to start finding people who could separate themselves from it all in a way, like you're saying, be detached, but not dissociated, where you're still participating, you're still trying to point out what you see, but you're not doing it from the perspective of some kind of like moral high ground. It's more like, hey, just look at the patterns. Just look. So
that's what happened, right? It's by dogmatic, meaning people all of a sudden brought their own political views into the therapy space right? Which is a big no-no. Every professional therapist should know that to begin with, right? But that's what has happened. This morality high ground, the virtue signaling, right? I've seen even posts on social media of professional therapists proudly announcing that they won't treat any Trump supporters, right? And dismiss them, or back with the vaccinations. Vaccinated shouldn't be allowed this and that. Or non-vaccinated people, right? We should shun them out and all of this. So you made a good point, because that's what I realized too. And a lot of people were disturbed, even our audience as well, and myself included, how a lot of quote unquote spiritual leaders, kind of fell for it all, right? The whole pandemic, even the vaccinations and all of that. Laura had to go through a disillusionment process with one of her teachers she studied with in depth, a very well-known somatic Buddhist teacher, right, hosting retreats in Colorado, meditation center. And he asked for people to be literally at least 2 boosters vax, have a COVID test before attending a meditation workshop. It's just insane, right? So it's really fascinating. We had a whole podcast on why spiritual leaders fell for the psyop, because it's really fascinating. It shows you that just a spiritual practice or having some sort of title of what you think you're doing doesn't show you that you're really aware of what's going on in the world. And that's what I realized too with my work. Like, there's 2 camps. There's people who maybe are deep in inner work, spiritual work, self-help, like you shared, right? But they have no understanding of what's going out in the world. So they're still subjected to social, cultural conditioning, media brainwashing, all of that. They don't question anything, right? And then on the other side of the coin, you have the hardcore truthers who are only externally oriented, but no inner work, right? And then they fall into the doom and gloom, typical black pill, everybody's control op, psyop, like darkness everywhere, which is not healthy anyway. So they project their own unresolved trauma and shadow onto the world as well, right? So either is too extreme. So hence, again, the balance of the inner and outer work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of the summation of what it is that I think drew me to your podcast in general. That inner balance, the inner work being just being able to ask the question, oh, like, how is this me? How am I the one doing this? But also being able to look out into the world and see like, oh, there are really nefarious things going on. And unfortunately, the further we go along in modern history, the more it seems that we're just uncovering more and more information to show that there are nefarious things going on, which is unfortunate.
Evil. That's a big issue.
Yeah.
That's what I realized. I'm actually in the process of working on a whole new course on spiritual warriorship and all of that. Really understanding, part of it is really understanding evil. And I had many misconceptions about it as well, because a lot of people, especially in the pop spiritual new age, kind of they deny evil, right? As the denial and everything is just light, the spiritual bypassing of, all is light, all is the divine from a high level, but on our lower level, divine is not all love and light, right? It's a mixture, right? So really understanding evil, not only in the external world, because there's tremendous evil out there, which a lot of people cannot even imagine, right? Especially people who they trust or they think they have their best interest in mind, which they don't, right? You even on a basic psychological level, really understanding psychopathy or sociopathy, how these individuals can mimic highly compassionate, empathetic beings, right? And really be very manipulative, because evil is not that obvious sometimes, right? It disguises itself in virtue and for the better good of the collective and all of that. It's very inverted and very subtle. But most importantly, also, that's what, Laura and I were really deep into Jungian work and shadow work, and really taking that as a quote unquote foundation to really understand and face your own darkness, your evil within yourself. Because everything what we see out in the world, we have within ourselves, at least in potential, right? And that's very hard for most people, even the truther community, to admit. Right? Because there's mostly this externalization of like, this the enemy, the victim blame trap, as I call it. As long as you're caught in that, nothing will change. And that doesn't mean to take into the new age love and light and just, forgiveness, let's not worry about anything. Like blind compassion, that's a trap too. Like the Buddhists call blind compassion, right? Idiot compassion, they called it. So boundaries are necessary, right? Or I've been also a big student of Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner, and they also talked about the necessity of facing evil, understanding evil, and action. Also confronting evil, right? Even there's this great book I've been reading recently, Essays on the Bhagavad Gita by Sri Aurobindo. His interpretation of the Gita, really profound. And he talked about also the main message of the Gita of Arjuna on the battlefield being advised by Krishna. He has this moral dilemma in war, like he doesn't want to engage in war and kill all these people. Like, I want to escape the world. I just want to live in nirvana. And he says, no, Krishna says, no, you need to act. Non-action is not a possibility, right? So you need to act, but without attachment or attachment to outcome, without attachment to failure or success. Just act in aspiration to the divine, to something higher, according to your true nature. And even in this book written by Sri Aurobindo, he's an enlightened master, and he said something very profound as well. He was very critical of nonviolence. He was very critical of Gandhi and all of that, right? Because it leaves the kingdom to the hostile forces, and sometimes even violence, sometimes even killing is necessary to defeat evil on some level. If it's, and this is coming from your true self, without attachment, without passion, without anger, without hate, it's a high level of being, right? And this can be obviously easily abused, like God told me to do this and that, right? But the point of it all is that we need to engage in life, in everyday life, right? And also face the darker forces, and understanding that we all have aspects of that within ourselves. So the best we can help the world is making the darkness conscious within ourselves, while also engaging in action and do the best we can do on the 3D physical level. Right. That's why even very controversial with Trump. So many people have so many different ideas about Trump. Right. I was never into politics. I couldn't care less. But something has changed, over the past few years for me through my inner work. And to see how the divine works or God works through everyone, no matter how distorted. Right. So, Trump has his idiosyncrasies, his character, or whatever. You can hate him or love him. Some people project savior images on him completely. He can't do wrong, right? Most people have, a lot of you have TDS. He's the antichrist or whatever, or deceiver and craziness. But I can see like how he is working on his own level of consciousness, being used also by a higher positive force to a certain degree, with all the distortions based on that level of consciousness, which is politics, right? Don't expect to somebody come in and bring enlightenment. That's not how it works, right? And then you see even the role of evil. Here's another paradox, like your experience over the past 4 or 5 years with this craziness, attempted enslavement of humanity, and really evil making its appearance. It did trigger an awakening on some level. It made people stop and question, hold on, what is going on? I've seen this a lot with people I've worked with, or people, Laura and I, we had them in our courses. A lot of people, quote unquote, woke up over the past 4 years. So you see the teaching function of quote evil, right? That we, right away in the moment, we divide things into this is good or this is bad. But something bad, what we perceive as bad, needs to happen to lead to something good and better, because it's brought out of the unconscious, the evil, right?
Yeah,
And then So you see this whole conundrum, how we just play like Plato's allegory of the cave, fighting shadows on the wall, which are our own shadows, but it all has an evolutionary teaching function when you really see it. But it's not about sitting back and just gazing on your navel. You need to engage, and then we stumble, we fall, we have 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and whatnot. That's just life as it is in this level of consciousness for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. I can really relate to the whole Donald Trump thing, because I was also like, I wasn't even interested in politics. I saw it as a game that was like beyond anything that I could influence. And so I just wasn't that interested. But there was something about the way that the institutions of the media and of the government itself, they went after this guy, that it just makes you pay attention. Like, well, why are they being so vicious? Because I've never...
Exactly.
I mean, he says things that are radical in a... they're not even radical. He says things that are off the wall. Yeah. And they, the attack on him made it so... Yeah, it really is interesting, given the COVID situation, and then the 4 years that we had under Joe Biden, in a way, it was almost probably beneficial in the long run, because it opened everybody's eyes up so much. And,
exactly.
And fortunately, it wasn't 8 years; it was only 4 years. Because given another 4 years, who knows, what would have happened. But one thing that's interesting to me, and this is something I think about a lot, is you were talking about how there's a lot of people in the psychiatry field or in like the healing space that they want to ignore evil. They just want to look at the light. And it's interesting because even from a Western religious perspective, we're in a time when we worship the light, we worship the sun, and it creates this dynamic where from an imagery perspective, you can see how if we're always just looking at the sun, we're always just looking at the light, then we're completely missing the shadow behind us.
Yeah.
And it really does seem like,
good analogy.
Yeah, it does seem like there's so much focus on positive thinking and, keeping your mood like staying in a good mood all the time and just being this positive energy all the time. And what I've seen probably from, I saw a lot in my growing up. I was raised in the LDS church, the Mormon church. And it was the mainstream version of it. But the way my family went about it, I think we were a little bit more intense than some other people that I was around. But it was actually that constant thinking that you're doing right, that constant focus on what is supposed to be good based on what's being told to you, that actually allowed for a lot of people in my life, and probably me included, up until I was able to kind of wake up from that situation, that focus on doing good is actually what enables you to do evil a lot of the time, because you think you're in the right, and because you're in the right, the ends justify the means in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And the shadow grows deeper. That's
right. Yeah. Yeah. But that other part that you were talking about, how we need to not only recognize evil, but there is an aspect of, or a necessity for us to step up and actually do something. I think this goes back to, or that idea goes back to the Jungian idea of balance. And I read a lot of Carl Jung, and his language really, his language and kind of the model for the psyche, it's really been helpful for me. But in our Western world, I see it almost as if this focus on the light, we're a monotheistic culture. And so I see it almost as if we've completely identified with the ego. And then on the Eastern side of it, you're talking about Gandhi and his pacifism. In a sense, it's almost like an obliteration of the ego. So just don't try to do anything.
Yeah.
And then, so one side we've completely attached to the ego and identified with it, and the other side it's completely get rid of it. And so in a way, they're polarities, and they're both the pathology on either side. And the balance is somewhere in the middle, where no, you haven't obliterated your ego. What you've done, and you haven't identified with your ego, what you've done is you've tamed your ego in such a way that you don't need it to operate all the time. But when the time comes, when you do need to step up and battle evil, when you do need to step up and set a boundary, or enforce a boundary, then your ego is there for you. And that's probably in our own individual lives, that's probably one of the better ways that we can combat evil.
Yeah. You hit at the ultimate paradox, right? I mean, there's truth to the idea of a necessity of obliteration, annihilation of the ego to embody the divine force and enlightenment and all of that eventually. But Sri Aurobindo, again, going back to him, he was very critical of India's not oversimplification, but distortion of certain spiritual truths, of completely negating the ego and seeing it as a bad, evil thing, because he saw that was the reason. Because, like you said, you become passive, powerless, or power is bad, ego is bad. So hence the English had an easier time to colonize and invade India in all of that, right? Because the Indians didn't own their own power, right? Like this passive approach. So there's that distortion, right? On the other side of the coin, you're right. On the Western world, we are very focused on the individual and the ego, right? And worldly desires and power and all of that. And it has its place too. But there's a paradox. I mean, even both Carl Jung and Sri Aurobindo said the same thing. Carl Jung said, I'm sure you heard of this quote, paraphrasing a little bit, the first half of life is building a healthy ego. The second half of life is destroying it, right? Sri Aurobindo said something similar before actually entering into the great work of giving yourself to the divine and annihilating the ego. Man, the human being or man, needs to establish himself in the ignorance, as he calls it, as a separate being, separated from the crowd, right? So what he described, Sri Aurobindo, even before Carl Jung was around, was the process of individuation. And the process of individuation, as you may know from Carl Jung, is not to be mistaken as becoming an individual as known in our society or culture, like cult of personality. I'm this big individual and I do these things. I can, make my riches, fame, money, whatever, right? That's fine, but individuation has nothing to do with self-actualization. Like, that's another thing I think you hinted before. A lot of therapy or self-help teachings nowadays, they work on they try to perfect the false self, mistaking it for the true self, making it a better false self, right?
Yeah, trying to get it to fit more in with the collective rather than what you're saying, to stand apart.
Exactly. And that ties into a quote by Krishnamurti, which also was part of my awakening when I first heard it many years ago. What was it? It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society, right? I'm sure you heard that one. So that's kind of like adjusting the false self to the craziness. It's just madness, right? So the process of individuation, that's the key point, right? And that, I think Carl Jung is the first one who really bridges psycho-spiritual work. I think, especially late in his day, he got deep into our spiritual work and the self from his cosmology, but like bringing in more this almost a transcendental aspect to psychology with the archetypes and the shadow and all of that, right? And the process of individuation is all about shadow work. It's also animus integration. That's another big piece, right? We see as well, to really bring forth the true self here with the big S. And this is it's not an easy process, right? Because the process of individuation, we see this in many people, because Laura and I, we've worked with hundreds of people in our programs. And many people are like right at this juncture, right? When they had this disillusionment process, they cannot relate to old friendships anymore, to their old life. Something needs to change, right? But it's a threshold. It's almost like a test to pass. And that there's a certain disillusionment, and especially letting go, right? And a lot of people have a hard time going through this. Then they fall back to their old addictions or way of living or relationships or way of life or compensate, whatever they use to plaster up their deficiencies and all of that. And the big part of the process of individuation is there's a phase of loneliness, right? Of being literally alone. And what Marianne Woodman, I'm sure you heard of her. She's also very influenced by Jungian's work. My wife Laura, she's big into her work. And she said something that we need to embrace our inner orphan, right? We need to embrace abandonment. It was like, that sounds pretty radical, because many of us have already been abandoned, maybe in childhood through our parents. But we need to embrace abandonment from the collective, right? From the group, from the consensus, from the mainstream, right? We need to embrace that. And that will entail, as it's written, and you see it in all, not only in modern psychology, but going back all the esoteric traditions, you hear then the masses, the consensus will attack you, right? For leaving the crowd. It will doubt you, right? It will attack, and all these kind of things to interfere. But these are the lessons, right? And if we give in to that, that's what a lot of people already give in, right? Then they don't step up to their power. They censor themselves, right? In order not to stand out, because they may get attacked and all this stuff comes up they don't want to deal with. But that's the fire of transmutation. So that's very important, this process of individuation, to actually create a healthy ego. A healthy ego means you have your own thoughts, your own opinions, you think for yourself. You're not an NPC, right? That's the newest thing, the NPC thing, where people just have these hive mind thoughts. Everybody thinks the same, says the same things. You see it both on the left or the right. They both have their own NPC version. Even the truther community have the NPC versions there as well, like these egregores, hive minds. No, in the process of individuation, you become truly individual with a healthy ego. What is a healthy ego? It means also that it becomes more an instrument for self, right? With the capital S to work through. You're the unique expression of the divine working through you, right? So that's an important state. And then at a later time, maybe in the later incarnation, whatnot, the ego can completely dissolve, right? But if it's done prematurely, then it ties into spiritual bypassing. You can fall into all kinds of traps. You can go mad, psychotic, right? The psyche has its own timetable. You cannot rush this process. But I think that's the process of what you mentioned about the quote unquote middle ground of the ego worship in the West, right? And the ego denial of the ego in the East, so to speak. So we need to bring both together, right? And I feel personally that Carl Jung has presented a model to cross that bridge.
Yeah. I think that's why he's been very helpful for me too. Because, well, for me, this whole there was a huge part of my life where I wouldn't have been able to have this conversation because I wasn't enmeshed in this type of discussion or in reading books or this type of dialogue. But when I had that experience of falling away from my faith and then, going through some trauma recovery, I had this Carl Jung and basically it's like a model, his model of just being able to label things and then talk about them and work on them. It was extremely helpful. Yeah. For you, I'm curious about your own personal story, your journey, like bringing this inner work and outer work together. What came first for you? Was it kind of like some of this healing process, or was it more of an attachment to the truther movement? And how did you get to where you felt like you had a grasp on either side of it?
Well, I'm still trying to find a grasp. But what happened with me, I think it all started, I grew up, as you can hear from my accent, in Germany, Munich, and I was always questioning there must be more to life, something else, right? But I was very timid, very insecure, got bullied, a very shy little child, and just went through high school normally, and then went and even enrolled to University of Munich, studying business, something, because it's everybody else is doing, and that's what my dad wanted me to do. And
yeah, I have an accounting degree and an MBA, so yeah, I've done this very similar path. Yeah.
So, just because money, that's just what you do. And I think for me personally, there was some sort of divine intervention, because all of us when I was a year and a half through college or university in Munich, I met my friend and he introduced me to the drums. And I was always fascinated by playing the drums, but I never thought I could do it. My parents didn't really encourage me. I was just fascinated by it, like a fantasy. And I remember the first time I sat down on a drum set, I was already 19 or 20 years old, in his basement, and I had like a natural grip on it, and all of a sudden I had a transcendental experience. It connected me to something I've never experienced before. I was like, oh my! And from that day on, this is what I want to do. It's like Joseph Campbell, who had also a big impact on me. Like, I found my bliss, right? Like, this is it. I don't care about anything else. I literally quit college. I worked at a hardware store, like saved up money, had all. My parents didn't quote unquote like it, but they eventually didn't put hindered me, but also supported me in their own way. So I give them credit for that. But then I came to the US, studied drums and percussion, and just stayed here, right? I found like I was just obsessed with it, practicing 8-9 hours a day. And that opened up, because for the first time drumming, especially back then, I was in pretty dark, heavy music, right? I grew up on the grunge, Soundgarden, even Pantera, Metallica, Alice in Chains, that kind of stuff, right? I had dreadlocks down my back and all of that. And what I realized looking back, I was doing shadow work back then. I was expressing all the rage, sadness, depression through my music, through the drums, right? That helped me really to process a lot. But at the same time, I had the thing, I want to be a rock star, I want to do this and that, right? So that didn't work out. But through this whole process, then all of a sudden doors opened up, and a lot of stuff came up within myself, and new feelings and emotions. And it also, I was in a new culture, right? Had to learn the language, all of that. So all of a sudden, I was also dealing with a lot of depression. And when my friend went back, I lost meaning in life. I was in despair. I had a day job. And I remember one day I woke up literally crying in fetus position, and with this voice in my head, you need to figure yourself out. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. You're going to kill yourself. So it was literally like that disillusionment that asked me, like, I need to figure things out. Like, suffering was this basically, right? That was the call. And then I remember going to the bookstore and then saw this book by Krishnamurti on the table, and it was with his profile, image was taken aback, and it was Freedom from the Known, like, right? And that's really opened up my journey. And then at the same time, as I started to getting more into philosophy, spirituality, got introduced to yoga, like Alan Watts, Krishnamurti, that kind of thing. One of my roommates introduced me to body work, yoga, introduced me to mushrooms. That was one, definitely initiation, right, in the 90s. So that blew everything open. And then at the same time also, then naturally I started questioning, okay, what are we being told and taught? right? There must be more to life. So naturally, I got into conspiracy stuff, right? Actually, my mushroom dealer back in the 90s introduced me to David Icke. So that's almost too classic. Kind of that red pilling, all of that, right? With VHS tapes before there was any, Google or whatnot, or YouTube. So that I tumbled down the rabbit hole that way. But early on, again, in my path was the inner and outer work. I got into Jungian psychology, the shadow, but I was doing a lot of intellectual and spiritual bypassing, meaning I was even reading Carl Jung in the 90s already. I was fascinated by it. I have a whole folder, still of my writings from back then. But I just intellectualized the process. I wasn't really doing it on the deeper somatic, emotional level, right? So it's easy. I mean, maybe you can relate to that. It's easy to read books, you resonate in the moment, but you don't really apply it. You just then lay it aside and forget about it, kind of thing, right? So then, because I became a body worker, I realized also the importance to get into my body, how the body stores trauma, unconscious wounds, and all of that as well, the somatic connection. Once you really follow your bliss, that's the key point in anybody's life. What I would advise to follow that, what really excites you, what you're enthusiastic about, as Joseph Campbell would say. Enthusiasm, as he says, comes infused by God, right? Something else. And that's what I really did with the drums. I didn't care, but I was just about the music, the art, let's do this. Or then body work and massage and healing work, I was really fascinated by it. I learned so many modalities. I was really passionate about it. And then I started getting into all these topics. I started writing just to organize my thoughts. I had a MySpace back then, just to write out my thoughts. So I started writing, and all of a sudden found, the more I was writing, the better I got at it. So I finally created a blog. But there was never the intention of, I'm going to be a writer now, or I'm going to be a podcaster, or I'm going to be a coach, or I'm going to do retreats, and none of that ever, right? It was more like, I want to learn about myself, the world, and I want to share it. That was literally it. But then I think that's, looking back, that's how you align yourself with divine will. It becomes more an expression of something else. And then doors open where there have been no doors before. So the path takes its own form, very uniquely tuned to you. And it's definitely not been easy. And at certain junctures, there were thresholds, tests, really, they ascend and descend. You feel, great, good. Then you go down into the shadow again, and relationship breaks up, trauma coming back around, all of that, right? But that's life. And the biggest realization I had that any hardship, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is an initiation. If you can really understand it, see the deeper teaching function, and not get into victim blame trap. That's the biggest one. It's so easy for most people to blame government, blame the system, blame the elite, or blame the ex-partner, blame the parents and all of that, or blame themselves. That's another, self-pity, guilt trip. It doesn't mean that to put up with abuse and all of that, but to see it in the higher context of all these lessons. And you can only see that if you have a certain understanding of psycho-spiritual work, or also spirituality, or a higher cosmology, right? If you have some sort of even scripture or teaching that helps you guide the way. But these teachings and scriptures can be easily abused. I'm sure, as you know, the biggest example would be, I would say, Christianity and the Bible. Interestingly, I grew up in Germany where there's only Christians, either Protestants or Catholics, but I could never resonate with Christian. For some reason, I don't know. It's nothing against it, but I could never relate to Jesus and the cross or the Bible. I read the Bible. It was more like an adventure story, but it never grabbed me. Right, I was more always drawn to the Eastern, to the mystical or maybe esoteric Christianity, right? More the mystical approach rather than the scripture. Because what I see, and I think that's maybe what you were hinting to in Christianity, especially nowadays. I mean, the US is a Christian nation founded on those principles, but there's a rise of a Christianity, which is good, but also a rise of a very dogmatic fundamentalist Christianity. I see almost a little regression, right? Of very identification with the Bible as the word of God, without questioning the most edited book in the history of, that it is edited out and things taken out of context and things taken literal. And the issue with that kind of dogmatic Christianity, on the side note, is, I think you mentioned it before, we project human qualities into God, right? With human morality and human logic, right? God is all of a sudden this external figure that rewards or punishes, right? And we put Satan as an opposite of God, to God, right? When it's actually also God, but on an unconscious level. It's all one, right? It's not separate. There's a false duality, actually, right? Sri Aurobindo talks about this false duality. But that's a conundrum as well. Then we externalize evil again, right? And don't get the deeper message, right? That what Jesus always said, find the kingdom within, that is within you. It's not out there. It's not in heaven. It's not in the afterlife. It's right here within yourself. That's the biggest message, right? So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, so to speak, my path and how I reconciled all these things. But it was, if anybody asked me why I do what I do, why I'm doing, the initiation was suffering. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, it seems like suffering is the initiation for deep thinking, for the seeking of truth. I resonate with a lot of what you're talking about. Being an introvert, growing up in a Christian, very literalized Christian environment. It took me a really long time to be able to step outside of that. And that's one of the things I talk about most on this podcast. And then in my, day-to-day life with the people who are willing to talk to me about it. Like, not everybody is, but is just the difference between literalizing the myth, literalizing truths or stories, characters, archetypes, literalizing it versus just seeing it as a symbolic representation of actually what's going on inside of each of us, and what's going on inside, the group as a whole, the collective. When I think about Jesus, it's actually taken me a long ways to get back to this Christian myth, because I was so disillusioned by it when I was younger. Yeah. But seeing it now as a psychological thing rather than as a literal truth has really changed the way that I look at it. And just the way that you were talking about, there's Jesus, but there's also Satan, and they're actually just part of the same God. I think about it that way, in the sense that there's Jesus, who is, again, we're looking to the light, the sun. And then if we're going to talk about the devil, if we're going to talk about other gods, this commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. All these things that get suppressed, like they're inside of our psyche, but they get suppressed and they...
By the way, real quick, this phrase, there shall be no gods besides me, fundamentalist Christians have used to attack Carl Jung. Like, you cannot, Carl Jung is a false idol, and or even like nowadays you see like yoga is the devil, yoga poses attract demonic. It's insanity out there, Yeah, all these yogi, these deities of the Hindu, they're all at different aspects of the divine. That's all it is, not different gods, right?
Right, yeah. Or even another way to think about it psychologically from a Jungian perspective is they're just all archetypes that could arise within us. They're all coded into us. I see it as like, as a human being, they're coded into our DNA, and as is story, the way that we interpret things. But I just see the Christian world has just put all of that into their shadow. And so it's all just kind of suppressed and shoved down there. But there's just something very powerful in the ability to take a myth, to take a story, even modern stories, fairy tales, and, even maybe Disney movies before like the last few years. Like in the past, you could really look at them, and as long as you looked at them psychologically, they had a lot of power. One of the things that, this is just like a simple example, but in our Western world, we're very obsessed with romance. It's one of our myths. And for a while there was a lot of pushback on a lot of the fairy tales and Disney movies, because it was always a boy saving a girl or a man saving a woman, But even that is, if you can understand the symbology of it, it's just the girl represents the anima, and I heard, I heard you talking about this on your podcast recently, because you guys did an episode on masculinity and, healing the mother complex and getting to know the anima and integrating the anima. And like these stories are there for us to each and every story can just be applied to yourself.
Yeah.
And when you start doing that, every story becomes much more interesting, and every story becomes much more powerful.
Yeah.
And and what you were talking about with also with every difficulty you have and every hardship you have in life is actually an opportunity for you to grow on a spiritual level, or to grow on a personal level. So you can start applying those same things into your everyday life. So like when difficulties do come up, when challenges or pains or hardships, whatever it is, setbacks, rather than even there, you don't have to literalize it as like, oh, this is the story of my life. Really, you can look at every opportunity and think, okay, well, how can I react better to this than I would have in the past? How can I grow from this?
Yeah.
There's just something powerful about not literalizing. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's easier said than done when you're in the midst of it, right? You're like, it sucks, it hurts, right? I project, I get, I would never, I have my own shadow still to deal with, and stuff comes up, even in my relationship with Laura, that's normal. And it's not important to beat yourself up for that, obviously, and then the guilt comes in, but, and then always, in retrospect, there's a deeper lesson, right? But you will only know it, because that's why I feel psychological education is so important, having psycho-spiritual knowledge. We're missing it all across the board, right? Especially nowadays, people have short attention span, they cannot focus, they're on the death scroll on social media, information overload, overstimulation, right? Especially kids, that's very dangerous nowadays. I feel if they get online or on phone too early, and all of that is not being taught in school. Ideally, like, you want to introduce that kind of knowledge already to aware parents and children, right? So you grow up with a certain understanding, right? Storytelling, like, you speak about storytelling. These kind of stories were told by the elders to the children, right? In more conscious societies or tribes. Nowadays, what do we do with elders? We put them in old home people, right? We don't even look up to our elders anymore, because they have kind of become dementia and whatnot. They're very hardened and all of that. You cannot blame them. Every generation is differently. But, Joseph Campbell said something very profound. Have you ever seen his series he did like in the 80s, right, shortly before his death with Bill Moyers, like a 6-part series on PBS?
I've read it as a book.
As a book, okay, nice, yeah. No, it's really, Bill Moyers asked Joseph Campbell, aren't you afraid of death? And he's like, no, because, quote unquote, ideally, when you're really in this archetypal process during the different stages of life, in your later life, you become less and less identified with the body, but more and more identified with who you truly are, your essence, right? And we have lost that nowadays. Hence the obsession with youth. You see it nowadays, where even like women in their 20s or 30s already get Botox and all of that, or men even, right? So it's this obsession, and to each their own. You want to take care of your physical body, absolutely, but don't be obsessed or so identified with it. There's something, we're missing the deeper lesson. And I think that's really the key, right? Because ultimately, any hardship, anything what's happened in life is meant to guide us to God, right? I just saw this quote by Carl Jung on Twitter. I just reposted this. He said that any addiction is a low-level search for God, right? As on unconscious level, we're looking for God, always, right? Through whatever means. And are you familiar with A.H. Alma's, his work, the Diamond Approach?
No, I'm not. Tell me about it.
Really very fascinating. He's very influenced also by Gurdjieff, whose work I've studied, like the Fourth Way teachings, kind of a combination of Sufism and esoteric Christianity. But he talks about these holes we all have, holes within ourselves, right? Holes are created through childhood wounds and all of that. We lock them away, and we try to fill these holes, because these holes means we're not connected to our true self essence. What do we fill these holes with? With relationships, stuff, right? Always just compensating, trying to find happiness via external means, right? That's the ultimate. We always want to, but it's a bottomless hole. It will never fulfill us, because what we're really looking for is God, our true self in essence. That's the key point, right? Once we have found that, the kingdom within, doesn't mean that we need to shut out. That's the other extreme, the hardcore, even Christian or Eastern approach, the ascetic approach of just denial of the physical world. Like, you need to have a robe and be poor and denial material riches and all of that. That's the other extreme. No, can connect to essence and enjoy all the riches of the world, all relationships, but you need to make it as a substitute for God or the divine, right? Hence, Age Alma, similar to Sri Aurobindo, said something which sounds very quote-unquote controversial to the ego, that God or the divine or essence needs to become before anything else, before your relationship with your wife, children, family, before nation, before anything else. Doesn't mean you deny them. But if you really live from self and your essence, right, you see it in the proper context, then you don't use it as a substitution, hence you don't become so identified with it. That's a problem. This identification what is the result of this identification? The result is any conflict, from interpersonal conflict up to wars, right? Is identification with my personality or with my family or my children or my nation, and So the more we can really live from essence, the less we use the outside world for our fulfillment. And that's the key aspect, right? That's what I remember myself every day because sometimes happens, we live everyday life. We have to deal with our finances, practical considerations, normal. Life happens, right? There can be hardships. But as Gurdjieff would say, remember yourselves, right? That, nothing can really disturb our true self, our essence. That's another point, that the true self, our essence, cannot be damaged, cannot be destroyed. It's always there. It's just covered up, right? I like David Hawkins' analogy. Like, he uses the true self, the essence is like the sun. It always shines. It cannot not shine, right? It only gets covered up by the clouds, and we then tend to identify with the clouds, our false self and all of that, right? And then we try to perfect the clouds, like, trying to make the clouds smile, when instead we need to just transmute and dissolve the clouds so the sun comes to the front again. I think that's really the work. That's really, and nothing will change in the world until more and more people grasp that or engage in this work, which is also a natural evolutionary process. As I'm sure you can see in yourself and others. You cannot force the process within yourself. You cannot bring this process to others. It's impossible. They will reject it, right? They will just, like Jesus even said, you will become enemy in your own household. That's what he meant when you will engage in the work. Then, don't leave us, don't leave the mass, don't leave the consensus, stay here, right? The process of individuation. So it's everybody's own soul calling, right? That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because it's the process of coming to see something can be so painful. But once you're on the other side of it and you can see it and you're like, oh, the pain is always worth it, because you get to a place where it's better. Which is one of the challenges, obviously, in our modern world, is like, we're so afraid of pain. We want to numb out everything. We want to take a pill literally to avoid every amount of pain. But once you get to the other side, the pain was worth it. And you just want to tell everybody else, like, there's this other side. You want to help, like, you're like, hey, I'm already here. I'll just help you get here. And it's something that I've realized in my personal life. The child who points out the problem in the family gets labeled as the problem. It's a scapegoat. Yeah. The politician who points out, the nastiness of the swamp, they get labeled as the problem. Yeah. Or Musk. There's a new Musk derangement syndrome. He's doing great with Doge, all the corruption, but he's being labeled as the Nazi and fascist. It's like, holy shit. Yeah. That one's an interesting one, because all he has is audit power. He doesn't have any authority to do anything. He's not the one canceling anything. He's just bringing things to light, and he's labeled so viciously for it. But also for me, I've got 2 kids, and we do homeschool with them. And so I'm also very interested in homeschool. I reach out to a lot of homeschool people. And that's another thing that's really getting attacked right now, especially as the Department of Education gets attacked, is it's interesting because through COVID, I saw this report that said through COVID, up to 11% of American families switched over to homeschooling. And I think some that's probably gone down as, after schools opened back up, but there was such a big surge of it that what happened was, rather than people take that information and say, okay, well, so what's wrong with the education system? they immediately began attacking homeschooling. And so, so you do see this.
How old are your kids?
My kids turned 13 and 11 this summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah. It's just a point that when you start going through the process of genuinely, like real genuine inner work where you're trying to better yourself, you're going to start seeing a lot of things in the outer world where you want to, either in other people's inner worlds or in the outer world where you just want to inform other people. But it's a dangerous path because they will turn on you. And I think that's a big reason why when you start to go down this path of genuine self-improvement, that there are so many relationships that you can't bring with you.
Yeah, recently I'm rereading, I've read this a long time ago, I'm reading this again, How to Know Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner, right, a classic. And he just was reading today again, even its introduction, never bring the work to others who don't ask for it, right? You see this in all esoteric traditions, same this thing, be silent, you cannot help others who don't ask for it. You have to do the inner work and then relate, be very, Gurdjieff talked about external consideration, always adjust to the level of consciousness and the belief system of others, right? Don't give when it's not asked for, because you just, even if it's of well-meaning intention, right? For the longest time, if I try to red pill my parents and bring this up, it always results in disaster and fighting and insanity, really. And as they get older, and I've gotten older, I have more maturity of really meeting where they're at, and really we have a more loving, accepting relationship, because I don't bring something to them which they, number one, don't ask for it. Number two, certainly not ready for it. And that's the next level of wisdom, that comes in a later stage, but not at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you try to point people's shadow out to them, they're going to just rail against you often. And I've had that same realization. One of the interesting things about it for me is when I look back on my own story, I grew up again in the LDS church, and I don't know if other religions do this, but in the LDS church, they often have an annual slogan, or like in the youth program, for example, they'll have some kind of a message that they want to get across for the year, or a slogan. And when I was a kid, when I was maybe an adolescent, around 12 years old, going through high school, the message to the youth of my generation was that we were the chosen generation. And it's it's a very good way to kind of build up the youth in a way to make them feel special, which for kids, I think is a powerful tool, both for good and evil. But the interesting thing about it now is that so many people in my generation have left the church. And it's just, I find the irony of it overwhelming, which is like, we were told that we were a chosen generation. And so when we went out and discovered something, like we took that hero's journey and came back with a boon that could be beneficial to others, being the older generation, they just completely rejected it. And now they think that we're all like these apostate, evil, sinners.
But you know what's interesting, Laura and I, we have done this, our group program, Embodied Soul Awakening. We've done about 3 times a year for the past 4 or 5 years. We've done 15 times or so. But almost each round, we have people who were part of the LDS Church of Mormon, right? Some people even more like dealing with a lot of cultish type of programming and insanity, right? To get out of that mind control program, almost very severe, right? But I see definitely a trend of more and more people kind of exiting this kind of dogmatic, cult-like behavior, especially Mormon LDS style. Is I had no idea what you guys the beliefs and what we even like all kinds of weird sexuality which you're not allowed to express. You're not allowed to drink coffee. Like what the hell? Like it's like it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then you have all these, because you had all these over the years. They have developed all these trying to, coping mechanisms to do something without really doing it or something, right? Since you're addicted to soda now.
Yes, sugar. Yeah, sugar is a big deal in Utah. Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's so literalized. It's much more literalized. And then also, general Christianity, they have this idea that if you believe in Jesus, then he'll save you, and that's all that it takes. But in Mormonism, there's like another step where it's basically you have to keep the commandments. You have to do all you can, and then Jesus will save you. So it's a much more it's a much more day-to-day, like very ingrained kind of a religion. But going back to this idea that you shouldn't try to take you shouldn't try to take the message to people if they're not ready, if they're not asking for it. It's one of the reasons, that I came and started a podcast like this, is because there are a lot of people out there who are willing to talk about it, like yourself. And it's just, it's just been very helpful for me. It's been starting a podcast is one of those things where it sounded fun to me. It sounded interesting because I like conversation. I like hearing what people have to say. I like throwing out my ideas and having people push back on them. But I never realized how much it would change me or help me just kind of settle into myself. And it's one of those things that I'm really grateful for. And then also, when I think about that, I actually think about the way that the psyche works, where for people who are driven, you get these goals in your head, you get these ideas of things that you want to do in your head. And I used to think that was the thing that you really wanted to do. I want to start a business. I want to write a book. I want to start a podcast. And you have these ideas of maybe like the experience or the success of that thing as being the goal. But what I've realized is that the psyche uses those kind of proximal goals to push us forward, because every time you get to the achievement of that thing you were thinking of, you suddenly feel like, oh, like, well, what am I doing now? Like there's something else. And if I think going back to that idea of passion or of Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss. When you do that, when you follow that thing, it'll usually push you just towards some creative venture, some kind of creative project. Yeah. And that thing alone will push you forward as a person. It'll help you kind of integrate, like you beating the drums and just working out some anger, working out some emotion. These things that for whatever reason fascinate us, if we give into those things, they're going to help integrate us in some way, integrate parts of us. And I think it's a pretty fascinating experience.
What just came to me as you were describing it, I'm not sure your experience is, but when you follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell says, right? And follow your creative impulses, or the daemon, your creative spirit, as Carl Jung would talk about. Even reflecting back in my life, it's not like, oh, I'm passionate, it's going to go smooth and you love doing what you love doing. No, I realized also each quote unquote bliss I was following, there was an opposite fear I had to confront and work through. Like Joseph Campbell says, the treasure you seek, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. It's like, even with playing drums was amazing, but I had to get number one, I started at the age of 20 years old, which like every 16 years old was already better than me. I had to get over my own, like, I'm not good enough. And this, on even stage fright, playing on stage, that was a big fear. Moving to a foreign country. Same with when I started writing, putting my words out there, I was really like, oh my God, dealing with the attacks and judgments of others. And then I got invited in 2016 when my work became more popular. I started to get invited on podcasts a lot, or even speaking engagements at certain festivals and conferences. And that was my biggest fear, public speaking. Like I'm so introvert sensitive. I remember I bought all 12 books of how to overcome public speaking, and I didn't even read all of them, but I recorded myself speaking, but I had to just jump into it. I remember being so nervous and in front before every podcast back then. It was insane. I was praying, like anxiety, panics. Now with you, like, okay, I'm looking forward to it. Now I'm enjoying it. I love actually teaching and lecturing, even working on my new course, and it's free flowing, but I had to confront that fear. So, I don't know if your podcast, but I'm sure there was also like certain things came up maybe before starting, and, and the growing pains and you learn and all of that. But the inability to face that fear is what keeps people actually disempowered out of their own choice. So here's another thing, Joseph Campbell, I'm sure you heard his famous hero stirrers, the hero story, right? Which is in every film on some level, right, in Hollywood. And the big thing is the call to adventure and follow your bliss. But what many people don't know, there's also the possibility of the refusal of the call. And then the story ends because you refuse the call. And the call is there all the time, I notice, even for people. But they, number one, may be blind to it because of their own conditioning. They cannot see the call, right? Or their fear and insecurity or social culture programming keeps them so disempowered that they don't want it. They have all the kinds of excuses why they're not going to answer the call. But underlying is the fear. So facing fear is essential on the path.
Yeah. I definitely, with podcasting especially, the idea of having to talk to somebody one-on-one for an hour at first was pretty daunting. I'm also like, an extreme introvert, and I didn't grow up with a lot of conversation in my life, but yeah, I can definitely feel that. And now I don't know if I get nervous. I said before we had to push the podcast back an hour. When I first started the podcast, I probably would have spent that hour like meditating, like you said, praying to get ready. Yeah. But then I was like, okay, well, how can I fill my time? I went out and hammered some nails into a chicken coop that I'm putting together, and it's a different experience. Yeah. But we're at an hour, so I just want to say thanks for spending the time with me. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I really am grateful that you have been brave enough to keep going on this journey, and you've gotten to the point where you are, where you can share this, with me through the podcast, which I really enjoy, the Cosmic Matrix, but also with all the other things that you're doing. I'm sure that I know that there are people out there looking for somebody to give them these messages, and I think it's great that you're able to do that for them. So thank you so much. Before we jump off, really quick, people want to find your podcast, do go on one of these retreats, find your writing. Where would they go to look for you?
Well, you can find everything on my website, veilofreality.com, all my writings, videos, the podcast, or you can find the podcast itself also on just Spotify or Apple Podcasts by searching for The Cosmic Matrix. But everything is on my website, veilofreality.com, also links to all my social media and all that. And thank you, Josh. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Thank you so much.